Hello, I'm Jonathan with Steel Bear Academy. Today I'm going to be doing a follow-up to the video that I made about the 4 rules of gun safety. This video is going to be about exceptions to the rules of gun safety. Now, this is going to make a lot of people very angry because people like to think that the rules of gun safety are absolute. They cannot be broken for any reason whatsoever. Well, let me first start off by saying, what are rules for? In the gun world, the rules are there because the rules are how we train. The rules are there for how we handle guns, and anytime we're handling guns, we are training for using guns. So the rules are how we train, and how we train is how we do it in real life. So keep that in mind moving forward. The rules are meant to be a guide. So I want to examine the validity of using those in real life. So does the guide hold true all the time? When you talk about rules, usually we're referring to rules in the absolute terms. Rules are there to create boundaries for people so that they can say, okay, so long as I'm inside these boundaries, then I'll be good. And people, humans, we really like boundaries. We really like rules because it says to us, I don't have to think as much. I can just create a shortcut in my mind, follow the rule, then I never have to worry about processing all this extra stuff. So rules are really good for some things. However, something I learned a lot when I was in college in rhetoric, in the art of persuading somebody, is you never want to speak in an absolute. You don't want to say always do this, never do this. We don't want to use that type of phrasing. We would want to say usually you should do this. Most of the time you should do this. Most of the time you should avoid this. Because that gives us flexibility for exceptions. Now, if you say to somebody some sort of absolute, you say, always breathe. You should always breathe. Well, really? Always? We should always breathe? Sounds like a good rule, right? But always? What if we're underwater? What if we're standing behind a bus and a bus just pulled away? Should we take a deep breath in then? So when you make a rule, you challenge people to find exceptions to the rule. I think instead we should probably say, usually you follow the rules, and let's say 99.9% of the time. However, I will also be the first to say that when you're first learning, it's better to just think that the rules are absolute. The rules are good. I don't want to give you any misconception. The rules of gun safety are very good. If you don't know the 4 rules of gun safety, then go take a look at my other video. I'll link it in the description. But the rules are good. And you should only break the rules if you have a really good reason. And do so at your own peril, because the rules are established and they've helped keep all of us safe for a very long time. But I'm going to give you some examples of times you're going to break the rules, or perhaps you might break the rules. And it's just to get the cogs thinking, just to get those gerbils running. You want to think beyond just those nice square parameters. As you become more experienced, you're going to understand a little more about why the rules exist and why sometimes you have to break them, and also some of the bad things that come with those rules. So let's get started. The first thing, number 1, I want to talk about kind of the inspiration for this video. I was reading an article the other day, maybe 6-7 months ago. There was a police officer in a neighboring town of ours that had inadvertently shot a bystander during the course of their duties. So I'll give you the short rundown. It was a cop in Guadalupe, California. At 9:30 p.m., this cop recognized a no-bail felony warrant suspect, and he stopped that suspect, I think, in his car. He approached, and at some point during this altercation, this contact, he shot at the suspect. And he inadvertently, I assume it's a he, by the way, I'm not sure, but the officer shot and accidentally hit and killed an uninvolved man who was sitting in a parked car down the street. I looked at the map, it's probably like less than 100 yards, but probably around 50, somewhere around there. So kind of far away. So this cop accidentally shot this uninvolved man during the course of their duties. And I thought, wow, that's tragic, right? Obviously. But what I was especially what especially concerned me was reading the comments. So many people in the comments section were saying things like, how could you do that? Why would you have shot without a backstop? Or my daddy always taught me to always know what's beyond your target, and other variations of that. Basically, they were saying that they were angry at this cop, had not followed rule number 3 of gun safety, which is identify your target, know what's around it, and what's beyond it. And so I thought to myself, these people sure have a lot of things to say about something they know very little about. And I don't mean about guns, I mean about the situation. So at the time, we had about as much information as I gave you, and pretty much now we have about that much information. Just the fact that it was 9:30 at night, it was dark, and that person was sitting in a parked car, so not a car that was lit, presumably, perhaps not, and was at least 50 yards away at night, is that in and of itself is enough to say, well, my guess is they probably didn't see them there. They didn't know that they were there. And this is the first thing I want to talk about is don't jump to conclusions about this kind of stuff. We don't know everything about situations as they evolve, and it's very easy to jump on the bandwagon of saying, I'm so smart, I know about guns, my daddy taught me about guns, I went and took a single class with me, for example. Well, if you just take 10 seconds to theorize, is it possible that cop didn't see that person there? Did they think they had a safe backstop, but then all of a sudden, turns out they didn't? It's not really negligence if you think you have it there, but it's not. Perhaps not legally, but in terms of how we should perceive them, perhaps they made every effort to have a safe backstop, and based on the conditions that they had at the time, they're in a pretty crowded neighborhood. It's like a suburb, kind of a suburb with half industrial section. So it's very easy for us to play armchair quarterback and say, they should have done this, they should have done that. Well, I want to say that this first exception to the rule is, it's really ideal to have a safe backstop, a point where you can shoot your gun and it doesn't injure anybody else or hurt anybody else. But in the real world, that probably is not really going to be possible. You can try, you can do your best to have that be the reality, but to give that cop his due, if he's or she is shooting at this suspect, chances are they are shooting back at them. And if you put it in that context, are you really going to be angry at somebody who's trying to save their own life? That cop is trying to save their own life by shooting back at somebody who's shooting at them. Are you going to tell somebody they broke the rules against safety? They should have known better. My daddy taught me. No. In the real world, you have 1 to 2 seconds to save your own life. And in that 1 to 2 seconds, you can't be concerned with, oh man, I got to make sure that there's kind of some people over there. Well, I guess I'll try to walk over here and try to save my life over here. It's just not going to happen. There's the ideal, and then there's reality, and those are very often not the same thing. Self-defense is messy. The use of force to defend yourself is often very messy. Not only legally, let's say, it's often messy legally, but it's also messy ethically or socially, logistically. That would be a logistical problem as well. Like I said before, humans like things to be simple. Rules are simple, and they make things so much easier for all of us, but the world is not that simple. So those people who are in the comments, they should have taken the 10 seconds to theorize that perhaps it's not so simple as my 10-second summation could understand just by reading those comments, just by reading that one article. And let me type out my comments saying how smart I am. Don't be that person. Take a second, put yourself in their shoes and think, that probably could have gone better, but hey, when their life's on the line, your life's on the line, you got to save it. So that's exception number 1. Exception number 2 we're going to be talking about things that you do in training that result in a bad habit. And we have a name for that. It's called a training scar. So a training scar is a bad habit that you get as a result of training. To kind of put that into more specific terms, when we're practicing a dangerous skill, whether it's using firearms or practicing martial arts or training for emergency events, we don't actually usually go and create those dangerous scenarios exactly as they occur because it's just too dangerous. So instead what we do is we modify them just slightly. Like for example, in martial arts, you don't go full force trying to beat the other person up as hard as you possibly can or trying to submit them in the most brutal way possible, because if you did, everybody would be injured and nobody would be able to do any of those martial arts. So you have to, either wear equipment that keeps yourself safe, in which case you are training unideally, you're now training with equipment that you would never have in a real life situation, like boxing gloves, for example, or shin guards or shin protectors or shoes, any of those things, although you might have shoes, but for grappling, you would not submit somebody as hard as you possibly could. You would try to get somebody to tap out without causing any permanent damage. And that's a necessity of training. However, it creates a training scar. A training scar is where you have a bad habit as a result of your training. So when you're pulling punches, when you're punching with not your full force, or when you're punching with more force than you would be able to reasonably cause on your hands, you're going to create some bad habits. And in the gun world, those training scars come out because of our rules of gun safety, and for other reasons too, but especially the rules of gun safety, some training scars occur. For example, the one that comes to mind is rule number one in my mind. Rule number one in my mind is always keep your gun pointed in a safe direction. Now, what that basically means is don't ever point your gun at anything you're not willing to destroy. That's another version of it. It basically means don't point it at any humans, don't point it at any animals, don't point it at anything that you can't replace. Another way of wording that is, if your gun's going to fire, can you replace that thing that it hits? So, when I'm using this gun, this is a unloaded gun, by the way. I have my magazine out, no round in the chamber, gun is unloaded. When I am pulling the trigger or moving my gun across something, if that chair is there and my gun fires at it, bang. Can I replace that chair? Yes, the chair is replaceable. In this room, I am not replaceable, so I don't point the gun at myself. Ideally, if I have a knowledge of my area around me, I will try to keep it pointed in the most safe direction possible. Even safer than that is to keep my gun holstered. Don't touch the gun. It's very safe in your holster. So that creates a training scar because, I don't know if you know this, but if you ever had to use your gun in self-defense, you're going to have to point it at somebody. You're probably going to have to point it at the bad guy, right? So it might seem a little silly. A training scar can seem silly on the face of it because we're balancing the safety that it gives us to have the necessity of doing that practice, not pointing at people. That compared to the, let's say, relative advantages that we get by not having that training scar, it's significantly better to just accept that training scar. But I just want to point out to you that will be an exception to the rule. If you're one of those people who thinks that all I have to do is follow the rules at all times and I will always be fine, well, if you ever had to use your gun in self-defense, you're going to have to break pretty much all those rules. So just be aware of that. You're going to have to point your gun at a human if you ever had to shoot somebody in self-defense. Otherwise, you're not going to hit them. So that's a training scar. And that's the second example of an exception. There are other training scars as well. One that comes to mind actually is, I was thinking about it the other day. When you do shooting competitions, like USPSA or 3-gun or probably IDPA as well, typically the way they do it is they set up a course. If you've ever seen those videos of John Wick doing his shooting practices for John Wick, meaning Keanu Reeves, he shoots in a course where you set up targets and you have a course of fire where you go and shoot all those targets and move through a course. Well, those courses are set up typically on a range in which other people are doing that course, and you have what's called a 180. You don't want to break the 180. So the 180 is where you have a line that is extending out from you in both directions in the bay of your range. So if this is where I'm standing and all the targets are that away, this is my 180. I have to make sure that I do not allow my gun to pass beyond the 180. So this is okay, this is okay, this is okay. This is not okay. This is like almost breaking the 180, and this is absolutely breaking the 180. Same thing on this side, this is okay. This is too far. This is absolutely too far. This would be a disqualification. So when you have this rule of the 180, it's a necessity for keeping everyone safe because everybody moves behind you, particularly the person who's timing you and following you and watching you to make sure you don't do anything disqualifiable. The person with the shot timer. Sometimes there are situations where, let's say I'm trying to run around this wall. Let's say there's a wall right here. I've got targets over here and targets over here. As I move up and I shoot these targets, bang, bang, if I'm going to get around this wall, I can't point my gun backwards. This would be a disqualification, right? This is pointing the gun at the people behind me. So instead what people do is they shoot their targets, bang, bang, they turn like this, keeping their gun pointed like this as they come around their wall, and then bang, bang, they shoot their next targets around the wall. Well, hopefully you can see why this is a problem. In the competition setting, it's a very good rule. It keeps us all safe, it keeps us from pointing the gun backwards, but it's a training scar. You know, why would you ever run around something where you are keeping your gun pointed behind you? You wouldn't. You would never do that. You would turn, you would keep your gun in front of you as you are moving around because you don't know, typically, what's around those corners. And so you need to keep your gun in front of you. It's also just not a very good way of running and moving. So people like to talk about how competition is such a great skill to practice, and it is. It's a very good training tool that we have, and it teaches us a lot of stuff that are very hard, a lot of stuff that's very hard to learn in any other situation, like managing stress probably is the main one, but also moving between targets, shooting at multiple things. But you don't want to think that it is a perfect representation of reality. It's not. There are some training scars, and so you need to be aware of that. You need to understand that the way you train is how you would do it in real life. We started off with that motto, right? You know, practice makes perfect. You ever heard of that? Well, practice makes permanent. The way you practice it is the way you will do it in the real life because your brain isn't going to have enough time to process trying to develop a skill set for a situation. Instead, it will revert to a similar situation and just follow whatever it is that you have already done repeatedly. So that's what we're trying to build in. We're trying to build in that software so that we don't have to try to reinvent the wheel in that moment of crisis. We want to have something already ahead of time. So competition setting is another one of those areas where we have some significant training scars. But again, I'll say it's still better than not doing it. Just be aware of those training scars. So that's exception number 2. Exceptions number 3. I'm going to call this the absolutes of the range. So in the 4 rules of gun safety, those rules are applicable all over the world, you know, in terms of, they're not just applicable at the range. In fact, at the range, they are actually not sufficient. Most ranges have even more strict rules than the 4 rules of gun safety. So for example, rule number 1 in my mind is keep your gun pointed in a safe direction. Now imagine that this is my bench at the range and all the targets are downrange. When you are using your gun, safe direction pretty much means exclusively pointed downrange. It does not mean that I can use the more traditional definition of safe direction, meaning not pointed at myself, not pointed at anything I'm not willing to destroy. So that means that I can't take my gun and keep it pointed downwards or keep it pointed in a safe direction and go handle over here and walk over here. No, all those things are not acceptable at most ranges. Perhaps with the rare exception that you might be able to move along the firing line if you keep your gun, locked open like so as you are walking along the firing line to go to another bench or bay on the firing line. And even then, that is not acceptable at a lot of ranges. They want you to do all of your handling from about here to here is about as far as you should move along that firing line. That is more strict than the real world. Although, we use the word strict in a bad sense perhaps, but it's actually more strict both in a bad and a good sense. Like in the real world, you have much, much more to contend with in terms of understanding where safe direction is. At the range, they've already established the safe direction is down there, assuming nothing goes wrong. The safe direction is down there. You can always point your gun down there. In the real world, you have to make a lot of choices, but the safest places for your gun are in your holster or unloaded, not on your body. Anytime you're handling the gun, it's pretty much an inherently unsafe activity. So the range has extra specific rules about handling your guns, and that in and of itself can create some training scars. You might think, if you're somebody who's really invested in the rules, if you're somebody who always follows the rules and you think all I have to do is keep my gun pointed in a safe direction. Well, at the range, there might be a safe direction, but in the real world, there really is no truly safe direction. Anytime we are handling our gun, anytime we're taking it out of the holster, anytime we're taking it out of the house, it's always unsafe. Like, you shouldn't think of it as safe places and not safe places. It's really all unsafe in terms of the grand scale of risk. As soon as you incorporate the gun into the world, it is a inherently more unsafe type of environment. Now that risk is still worth it in a lot of cases, but you just need to be aware that you can't, I would suggest not thinking of it in terms of this is safe or this is unsafe. Just think of it as all being relatively unsafe. And I think that's kind of what Jeff Cooper was going for with the treat every gun as if it's loaded. It's easier if you don't differentiate between safe and unsafe or loaded and unloaded. Not sure if I got those wrong with the hands there. Safe and unsafe, unloaded, loaded, if that makes sense. So it's just easier to pretend like it's all unsafe. It's just easier to pretend every gun is loaded. That way you don't have to differentiate any of that stuff. And my point with that was just that it's another version of don't get so attached to the rules that you forget to think about what the rules are trying to get you to do. And don't get so attached to the rules of the range that you misunderstand that the range is not reality. The range is not real life. If you think that somehow there is a safe direction, I think that you are telling yourself a comforting lie. So I would just say, try to break that rule. Try to think in terms of the safest direction. I think Mr. Asp, I forget his name, the guy who does active self-protection, he used a term that I liked the other day. He said, rather than think of a safe direction, think of pointing your gun in the direction of least consequence. Meaning, it's not that it's safe to point your gun there, because we're always handling guns, they're all kind of unsafe, but he's saying it's the least consequential place to put it. And I think that's a good way to think of it. The direction of least consequence. The next area I think is important to cover is an exception would be when you break the rules of the range in the real world, especially for ergonomic things that you're doing with your gun. So let me give you kind of backstory on why this came to mind was when you're teaching older women or anyone with diminished hand strength, that group is often older women, but it could be older men too. Anyone who has something that is not typical with their hands or their forearms or their upper arms or their shoulders or their elbows or anything that is not normal, standard human physiology, it can be a challenge to rack the slide on a semi-auto handgun. So racking the slide is that process of moving this slide that is always under spring pressure to close. It's always trying to close itself. It's pulling back, overcoming that spring, and then letting it go. That's racking the slide, right? Well, for most men, that is a pretty easy thing to do. And so long as they don't have any physical ailments, most men can do that pretty easily with just minimal ergonomic assistance. However, a lot of women need some ergonomic assistance. And what I mean by that is, rather than, let's say, doing it in the way in which a range would like you to do it, where you keep it pointed in as dramatically downrange direction as possible. So imagine my downrange is that way, our bench is along here. People at the range would like it for you to keep your gun pointed downrange the entire time and do all of your racking with your gun pointed perfectly downrange. They don't want you going like this, because that would be a breaking of the rules. We're pointing down the firing line. That would be not okay. They also don't really want you pointing your gun downward either, because down is usually concrete, usually beneath you, and concrete is not a very forgiving substance for keeping your bullets traveling in the direction that you want them to. They can do strange things on concrete, so we don't want to point at the concrete either. But those are necessities for the range. So they are trying to keep us as safe as possible. But in the real world, so long as it's a safe direction, it really doesn't matter how you are orienting your body to rack your slide, with perhaps the exception if there are people beneath you. But let's say there's no one beneath you. There's nothing wrong with racking your slide down here. So long as this is a safe direction, so long as you follow all the other rules, there's nothing wrong with that. And for ladies or people with diminished hand strength, it can be a very big ergonomic advantage to utilize more of your bicep, this muscle here, rather than keep it out in front of you, trying to utilize your triceps and your deltoids, your shoulder muscles. These are not the best muscles for doing things out here. Now I can do it. I have no problem doing it out there, but I can tell you it's not the most ergonomic thing. You probably know that, but when those people come to me who need help racking those slides, I give them the guidance of saying, okay, well, try it this way. This is how the range wants you to do it, and they can't do it. I give them all the normal suggestions about pushing and pulling, and it still doesn't work up here because it's just in such an ergonomically compromised position. Once I get them to pull it down to the side, then I get them to pin their arm, pin their hand against their kind of lower liver area, I guess. This is whichever side the liver's on. This is kind of the lower belly area. Once I get them to incorporate it down here, most people can do it down there much, much easier. And many, many people who could not previously rack their slides finally can do it. And they say, oh, that's not that hard. Typically, after they are able to do it in the most ergonomic way possible, then they are often able to do it in the less ergonomic way possible. So it's really more of a confidence issue. But my point is that if you're talking about exceptions to the rules, you shouldn't think of this as being the way in which you should rack your gun. This is a necessity for the range. You should rack your gun in as ergonomic a way as possible, preferably in perhaps as quick a way as possible. It's not like a super essential thing to do it super fast, but if you're practicing for speed, if you're practicing for that life or death moment when you need to rack your slide quickly, I guess so. It probably wouldn't happen, but sure, why not? If you want to do it as quickly as you can, maybe you don't want to do it there. You would drop your mag, insert your mag, come over the top, rack it this way, come around. Okay, perhaps it's a little faster to do it over here, but it's not as ergonomic, and I think I prefer generally to do things in the ergonomic way rather than the less ergonomic but slightly faster way. It's just personal preference, I suppose. But my point is that people get so attached to the rules of the range that they forget that the range is an artificial environment. The range is a place that we can all mutually agree upon having one direction that is the safe direction, and then rules about firearms so that we're all safe and we're all content to follow those rules, and we're not trying to each of us understand these 4 rules against safety and each have our own little sphere of understanding them. It's just easier and simpler to have one rule of the range. However, I just want to point out that it's an exception to the rule to the rules of gun safety if you think that your gun always has to stay pointed directly in front of you, always. It's just an exception to the rule. So that is exception number 3. The absolutes of the range are not absolute. Exception number 4. I'm going to talk about trigger discipline. So trigger discipline is where you have to remember the second rule of gun safety is, in my mind, is keep your finger outside the trigger guard, off the trigger, until your sights are on target and you've decided to shoot. Jeff Cooper's version of that is finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target. Now, as I covered in my other video, there's a few things to think about with that one. When we have that rule, the rule is there, 1, to make us aware that the gun can't fire unless we pull the trigger, barring any strange, unusual problems. But typically, 99% of the time, the gun can't fire unless we pull the trigger. It is us who causes the gun to fire. That's what we're trying to drill in our minds, right? In addition, we also are trying to defeat any human tendencies that occur when we're handling a gun, meaning a device that is ergonomically designed to have us rest our finger on the trigger. Every ergonomic thing about this gun is telling me my trigger finger goes right here. That's where it should go. That's what the gun is designed to have me do. Now, instead, we have to discipline. We have to have trigger discipline to keep our finger up and away from the trigger, outside the trigger guard, to make it so we don't pull the trigger. You don't even really want your finger resting along in line with the trigger, because if something startles me, somebody comes up and slaps me, it's going to be natural for me to clasp all of my fingers together. It's not natural to keep this finger extended while I clasp the rest. All of them come all at once, right? So we keep it up high and away so that if somebody does slap my back, I basically am still trying to close my hand, but the gun gets in the way of my hands closing, of my finger pulling, right? I'm not doing this. So trigger discipline is doing that. It's keeping your finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target, or you're on target and you've decided to shoot. And the reason we word it that way is because we want to differentiate between when you can put your finger on the trigger and when you can't. So in Jeff Cooper's version, when you can put your finger on the trigger is when your sights are on the target. So as soon as my sights are on the target, I can put my finger on the trigger. My version says once your sights are on the target and you've decided to shoot. So until you have decided, I'm gonna pull the trigger right now, or in the next second or so, don't put your finger on the trigger. So my version would keep my finger off the trigger until my sights are on the target. And until I've decided to shoot, I don't put my finger on the trigger. Once I've decided to shoot, then I can pull the trigger, bang. And what I'm trying to do with that, and what many other people are trying to do with that differentiation, we're trying to avoid negligent discharges, right? We're trying to make it so you don't inadvertently pull the trigger when you shouldn't. However, as we talked about earlier, if you are in a life and death situation where you have to pull the trigger shooting a bad guy, you're going to have to break that rule. And that's when it gets a little fuzzy. It's hard to know exactly, it's hard to prescribe a rule to when you should put your finger on the trigger for all situations, because generally it's a fluid environment, and it's really hard to put rules and parameters around that. But I think that my version of the rules, until you've decided to shoot, I think that my version keeps you from accidentally pulling the trigger more than Jeff Cooper's version. In my mind, it's not enough to just have your sights on the target. You need to have your sights on the target and those two conditions, both of them. And you have to decide you're going to shoot now. I wouldn't recommend having a situation where you have pulled your gun out and you haven't decided to shoot yet, but you have your finger on the trigger, if that makes sense. I wouldn't recommend holding somebody at gunpoint or at a moment where you're not quite sure if you are going to shoot, or you're not sure if you're going to shoot. I wouldn't recommend putting your finger on the trigger in that situation. But I'm sure there are situations where you might want to. The point I wanted to make about this is that it's, again, if we get so attached to the rule, there are exceptions to the rule. So one exception might be if you are grappling with somebody. If somebody has touched you, they've put their hands on you, and they are now in contact with you and they are manipulating your body. In martial arts, as soon as you touch, you are grappling. As soon as your hands touch their body, or as soon as your bodies are touching in any way, you are essentially grappling. And grappling in the broadest sense is really just like inflicting power or force against somebody. Though typically what we think of is wrestling, or rolling around, or that kind of wrestling type activity. But really, grappling can be as simple as shoving. Shoving is grappling, pushing, takedowns, all those things. Body manipulation, arm drags, wrist holds, all those things are grappling. And so if you are grappling with somebody and you are the type of person who does not have enough skill, or you think that you need your gun, if you don't have enough skill to be able to get somebody off of you and be able to get away, or you think you can't, if you think you're going to die or have serious bodily injury if you don't use deadly force, I can't give an example of it at the moment because it's going to take too long, but let's say all the rules for using deadly force would have been met. Let's say you're a little old lady and there's no way that you could beat somebody who's my size, somebody my size is grappling with this little old lady. Her only chance, really, most likely, to be able to come out of this without serious bodily injury is to use her gun, let's say it's on her hip like it is mine. If she's going to get to her gun, she is probably not going to be able to clear this person who is trying to grab me. Let's say they're trying to grab me. I might have enough time to get away enough to draw my gun, maybe. Little old lady probably won't. Little old lady might have to do what she can to try to keep the bad guy away from her so that she can draw her gun, in which case she has very little distance between her and the bad guy, right? So she's gonna have to put it up to the bad guy, pull the trigger, probably somewhere around here so she can at least see where she's pulling the trigger into. Probably not gonna be coming up here like this. But were my sights on the target at all? Could I see down my sights? My sights were probably pointed at the target, but I couldn't see my sights. So again, I'm gonna repeat this over and over again. If you get so attached to the rules, if you become one of those people who thinks that the rules are absolute, like those people in the comments section, you're gonna be at a disadvantage in the real world because you're not gonna be able to use the old noggin. Use the old noggin, do some theorizing, practice. Understand that there are situations where you might need to break the rules. The rules are there to keep you safe, but if you follow them to the letter and strict adherence, they might actually hurt you. So be mindful of that. Number 4 is trigger discipline. The exception to the rule of trigger discipline, following the rule as it is written. There are exceptions. One of those exceptions might be when you are grappling, you might not be able to put your sights on the target. You might not even know where your sights are. So that metric, if that's how you train, then that metric might not work out. So exception number 4, trigger discipline. Trigger discipline is not absolute. There are times when you might put your finger on the trigger when your sights are not on target. Exception number 5. This is going to be dry firing, cleaning your gun, gunsmithing. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are times when your gun is unloaded. So Jeff Cooper's rule number 1 of gun safety is treat every gun as if it's loaded. Well, what that really means is follow all the rules all the time. And that's my rule number 4. My rule number 4 is treat every gun as if it's loaded. Don't get complacent with the other rules. Follow all the rules all the time. Now that kind of flies in the face of this video, right? It kind of flies in the face of, don't create exceptions. That's really Jeff Cooper is saying don't create exceptions or try to differentiate between loaded and unloaded guns. Just practice as if they're all loaded. But I do want to say that you can't do any of those things. You can't dry fire, you can't clean your gun, you can't gunsmith if you don't recognize that there are times when you can touch the trigger and when you can put your hand in front of a barrel. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, well, it's all assembled, but if you want to put your hand in front of the barrel of this gun, is this okay? Is this all right? I'm basically putting my hand I'm pointing the gun at myself, right? Now that might seem a little silly to you. You might be thinking, Jonathan, that's just silly. Everybody knows that you can take your gun apart and clean it. Well, I think you'd be surprised. I think you'd be surprised how many people are out there that think that the rules are absolute and they cannot be broken for any reason. Those people in the comments section about that police officer, those people are adherent to the rules. It's not about the intent of the rules, it's about the rule. The rule is what is important to them. So we break the rule of we treat some guns as if they are loaded quite frequently. So for example, what I just did there, I dry fired my gun. I made sure it was unloaded, checked my barrel, checked my chamber, I should say, checked my magazine, pointed in a safe direction, pulled the trigger, bang. I broke the rules of gun safety there as far as Jeff Cooper would be concerned for rule number 1. But we practice dry firing a lot. Dry firing is a really great way to practice your trigger control. And it's a good way to get a lot of reps in on your trigger and not spend any money on ammo. I just took my gun apart there. You could see that was a necessary part of cleaning. If I do any gunsmithing on my gun. So even though we teach that you treat every gun as if it's loaded, there are times where you would handle a gun. And in my mind, if you are handling a gun, you should always treat it as if it's loaded unless you're doing something, unless you have verified it as unloaded and you're going to do one of those functions. And even then you should still keep it pointed in a safe direction, keep your finger off the trigger until you're on target, ready to shoot, all those things. But we have that rule, but we break it a lot. And everyone in the gun world understands that we break it all the time. So the rule begs for exceptions. It begs to have exceptions. Like if you put your gun away in the safe and your habit is to keep it unloaded or put it on the table at the range and it's sitting like this on the range, this gun is unloaded. We can see that it's unloaded. We really do treat them differently. If I treated this gun as if it's loaded, I would never pull the trigger. But that means I can never take the gun apart. So now I know what you're thinking. That sounds silly, right? You're probably thinking to yourself, Jonathan, you're creating extremely unlikely scenarios to validate exceptions. Well, that is what an exception is. The world is not so simple that we can just say the rules all the time have to be followed. People always want to find exception to that. And I think that we should just acknowledge that the rules are not perfect. We should acknowledge that Jeff Cooper didn't come on down from heaven and he delivered unto Moses some stone tablets and came down with the 4 rules against safety off the mountain. don't think of them as the rules of God. They are guides to help us deal with a very dangerous activity. And as far as a guide goes, they're pretty good. But I just think that we should give them credit and recognize that they are not perfect rules. If they were better rules, we would have all these list of exceptions that I just described written into our rules. But they don't really roll off the tongue as easy. And if I had to give a 45-minute demonstration on, I wouldn't even be able to cover all the exceptions to the rules in 45 minutes. Instead, I can give maybe a 10-minute version of those safety rules. So to get somebody started, to at least have those rules solidified so that we can at least start exploring how the gun works and exploring, the nuts and bolts of actually shooting before we actually start exploring exceptions. Because we don't need to know those things right now. We don't need to know exceptions right this moment when we're teaching the first time shooting. That's not important at the moment. And so with that final discussion on dry fire and cleaning and gunsmithing, we've come full circle. If we're going to acknowledge, we need to acknowledge that the gun rules are not perfect, and we should be comfortable with the fact that the world is more complicated than those people on the comment section on that, about that cop story, would like to think. I just want you to take some time to think about this and just to get the old hamster rolling. The gun rules are not perfect, but they are really, really good. And I want to finish with that the 4 rules of gun safety are there for a reason, and we follow them 99% of the time. And hopefully now, instead of thinking they are perfect 100% all the time rules, you understand that there are exceptions to those rules. And hopefully you and I together have become more experienced, more knowledgeable, so that we are not just slaves to the rules. We are actually using our brains, and we are responsible gun owners. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.